Look at her. Celine mocked. The pride of our lineage, married to a beggar who sleeps in the dirt. The elite sneered, splashing wine onto Carrion's humble hem. They saw a broken girl without a wolf, tethered to a nameless vagrant. They didn't see the truth. They didn't know that the man they called a nobody was Rowan Silverclaw, the legendary Alpha King in exile. As the mockery reached a fever pitch, the ballroom doors didn't just open. They groaned under a presence that turned the air thin. The reckoning had arrived. The chandelier crystals of the Reyes estate rattled as a wave of laughter crashed against the vaulted ceiling. At the center of the ballroom's marble floor, Carrion stood perfectly still, her spine a rigid line of defiance that belied the frantic hammering of her heart. She wore a dress of simple faded wool, a jarring gray smudge against the kaleidoscope of silk, velvet and gold that adorned the rest of the Silvercrest elite. Look at her, Celine's voice projected with practiced theatrical cruelty. She paced around Carrion, the train of her emerald gown snapping like a whip. The pride of our lineage reduced to a common charwoman. And for what? For a man who carries the scent of pine needles and poverty. Celine reached out, snatching Carrion's left hand and thrusting it into the air. The crowd surged forward, their faces twisted into masks of hungry amusement. On Carrion's ring finger sat a band of dark, weathered oak, hand-carved with rough patterns of ivy. It was a piece of forest trash compared to the diamonds surrounding them. A wooden ring, a high-ranking duchess sneered, her voice dripping with mock pity. Did he find it in a gutter, or did he have to chop down a tree to afford your price, Carrion? He didn't have to buy me, Carrion said, her voice small but steady. He chose me. And I chose him. The laughter doubled. A young alpha from a neighboring territory stepped forward, intentionally spilling a drop of dark red wine onto the hem of Carrion's humble dress. Then where is he, little rabbit? If this Rowan is such a paragon of devotion, why is his bride standing here alone? Or is he currently out hunting squirrels for your wedding feast? Carrion felt the sting of tears prickling her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of the small drafty shack in the forest, the place her family called a hovel, but the only place she had ever felt truly safe. She thought of Rowan's calloused hands, the way he looked at her as if she were made of starlight rather than broken wolf spirit. He had told her to wait for him. He had promised that tonight the world would finally see her for who she was. He is coming, she whispered as much to herself as to the room. Oh, I'm sure he is, Celine laughed, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. Perhaps he's currently being detained by the gatekeepers for looking like a vagrant. Or perhaps he realized that a Reyes daughter without a wolf is a burden even a beggar can't afford to carry. Celine leaned in close, her breath hot against Carrion's ear. You've disgraced us for the last time. Once this ball is over, you aren't just exiled from this house. You are dead to the Silvercrest pack. Go back to your shack, Carrion. Die in the dirt with your nameless husband. Carrion looked around the room, searching for a single gaze that held mercy. She found none. There was only the cold, glittering silence of the elite, waiting for her to break. She gripped the wooden ring until the grain bit into her skin, praying for the doors to open, praying for the man the world called a nobody to prove them all wrong. Chapter 1. The thunder that shook the peaks of the Iron Mountains was not born of clouds, but of magic and betrayal. High above the jagged tree leaned Rowan Silverclaw, the Alpha King whose name once commanded the silence of entire continents, stumbled through the freezing slush of an early winter storm. His breathing was a ragged, wet sound that echoed the cavernous wound in his side, a gift from the silver-tipped blades of his own high council. Just hours ago he had sat at the head of the obsidian table discussing the winter grain stores. He had looked into the eyes of men he called brothers, unaware that beneath their velvet robes lay the daggers of a coup. They had struck with the precision of vipers, using ancient, forbidden runes to suppress his wolf and poison his blood. He had fought his way out of the capital, a whirlwind of claws and desperate fury, but even a king had limits when his very spirit was being suffocated by black magic. Now, the forest of the northern territories pressed in around him, a labyrinth of shadows and biting frost. Every step was an agony that threatened to pull him into the welcoming dark of unconsciousness. He could feel his internal fire flickering, the majestic white wolf within him whimpering as the silver poison coursed through his veins. Behind him, the distant baying of hounds and the rhythmic beat of armored boots told him the hunters were closing in. They didn't just want his crown. They wanted his head as a trophy to validate their new regime. His vision blurred, the towering pines turning into distorted ghosts that mocked his fall. He who had brought peace to the warring packs was dying like a hunted animal in the dirt of his own kingdom. His hand, slick with blood that shimmered with a faint dying gold light, caught a low-hanging branch as his legs finally gave way. He collapsed into a hollow beneath a massive ancient oak, the roots cradling his broken body like a wooden grave. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was a numbing blanket, drawing the pain away and replacing it with a terrifying hollow peace. As the sounds of his pursuers grew louder, Rowan closed his eyes, his fingers brushing against the cold earth. He was the Alpha King, the Silverclaw heir, and yet in the end he was nothing more than a dying man returning to the soil. Just as the darkness prepared to swallow him whole, a different sound pierced the roar of the wind. It wasn't the harsh shout of a soldier or the snap of a hunter's bow. It was the soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the snow, gentle, hesitant, and carrying the faint, sweet scent of mountain wildflowers and wood smoke. Through the haze of his fading consciousness, Rowan saw a flicker of light, a lantern swinging in the gloom. He tried to growl, to bared his teeth in a final act of defiance, but all that escaped his throat was a broken sigh. As the light drew closer, illuminating a face of startling, quiet beauty, the king let go of the world, certain that death had finally found him in the form of an angel. Before we continue the story, please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. Thank you. Now let's continue. Chapter 2. The lantern light swayed, cutting golden swaths through the swirling sleet as Carrion knelt beside the massive oak. She had come out looking for a lost goat, but the sight that met her made the breath catch in her throat. Propped against the roots was a man who looked more like a fallen monument than a traveler. His clothes were shredded, dark with freezing slush and a terrifying amount of blood that seemed to shimmer with a strange metallic luster in the low light. Her first instinct was to run, to fly back to the safety of the village and sound the alarm. In a world of wolves and predators, a bloodied stranger was a harbinger of death. But as she moved the lantern closer, the light fell upon his face. Even beneath the mask of grime and agony, there was an arresting nobility to his features. A jawline carved from granite and a brow that seemed burdened by a weight far heavier than snow. When his eyes flickered open for a fleeting second, Carrion felt a jolt of electricity surge through her chest, so violent it nearly made her drop the lantern. It wasn't the predatory heat of the alphas she had known in the Silvercrest pack. It was something ancient, a deep, resonant pull that hummed in the very marrow of her bones. For a woman told her entire life that she was silent and spiritless, the sudden roaring recognition in her soul was deafening. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, though she was the one trembling. She reached out, her fingers brushing the burning skin of his shoulder. The heat coming off him was unnatural, fighting against the silver chill of the mountain air. He let out a low, guttural groan, his hand instinctively twitching toward her, not to strike, but as if seeking an anchor in the dark. Carrion knew then that she couldn't leave him. If her family found a wounded stranger on their lands, they would either enslave him or execute him as a threat. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Carrion hoisted his arm over her shoulders. He was massive, a literal mountain of a man, and every step toward her secluded shack was a battle against the howling wind. Her lungs burned and her vision blurred, but that inexplicable tether between them pulled her forward. It was a magnetic force, a silent command that told her his life was now bound to hers. By the time they reached the small, weather-beaten cabin, Carrion was nearly spent. She maneuvered him onto her modest cot, the wooden frame groaning under his weight. As she began to peel back the ruined fabric of his tunic to tend to the horrific wound in his side, the air in the small room seemed to vibrate. The shack was a place of poverty and exile, a derelict box of shadows. But as she watched the stranger's chest rise and fall in a jagged rhythm, it felt like the center of the universe. She didn't know his name or the sins that had brought him to her doorstep. She only knew that as she dipped a cloth into warm water to wash away the blood of a king, her own dormant heart was finally starting to beat. For the first time in 27 years, Carrion Reyes didn't feel like a disappointment. She felt like a guardian. Chapter 3. The weeks that followed passed in a blurred rhythm of shared silence and healing. Rowan, now moving with a guarded grace that belied the severity of his wounds, had settled into the role of a traveling laborer, a vagrant, whose presence in the village was tolerated only because Carrion took the brunt of the community's disdain. In the small dim kitchen of the shack, Rowan would sit near the hearth, his large frame dwarfing the rickety furniture, while he sharpened tools or mended the roof with a quiet, lethal efficiency. To the world he was a penniless drifter, but to Carrion he was a mirror reflecting a version of herself she had never dared to see. "They call you silent, Carrion," Rowan said one evening, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her very chest. He was watching her hands tremble as she recounted a particularly cruel encounter with Celine at the village well. "They mistake your kindness for emptiness because they cannot hear the roar behind your heart. But a wolf doesn't need to howl to be a predator. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the forest is the shadow that doesn't move." He began to teach her not just how to survive the mockery but how to dismantle it. He spoke of the alpha's gaze, the ability to look through an opponent until they felt the weight of their own insignificance. Under his steady, unwavering tutelage, Carrion felt her shoulders square and her chin lift. When she practiced speaking her truth in the safety of the shack, her voice lost its brittle edge, replaced by a resonance that felt like it had been pulled from the mountain's roots. Rowan was helping her build a fortress out of her own spirit, even as he worked to reclaim his own. In the late hours of the night, while the village slept and the frost patterns grew thick on the glass, the vagrant disappeared. Rowan would sit by the window, his eyes turning a sharp molten silver as he reached out with his dulled but still formidable senses. He was monitoring the shifting winds of the rebellion, listening to the hurried footsteps of messengers on the forest path and the hushed conspiracies of local lords who thought no one was watching. He saw the Reyes family crest on letters carried by riders in the dead of night, and he felt the growing rot of the High Council's reach stretching toward this very valley. Carrion would often wake to find him staring into the darkness, his expression one of cold, kingly calculation. Yet the moment he realized she was watching, the hard lines of his face would soften into something impossibly tender. He was a king in exile, weaving a net to catch his enemies, but in the quiet shadows of that shack, he was also a man who found his only peace in the presence of a woman the world called worthless. He was the shadow, and she was the light he was learning to protect, even as the storm of the rebellion gathered speed just beyond their door. Before we continue the story, please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. Thank you. Now let's continue. Chapter 4. The rain drummed a relentless rhythmic beat against the wooden shingles of the shack, sealing the world away in a cocoon of mist and wood smoke. Inside, the only light came from the dying embers of the hearth, casting long flickering shadows that danced across Rowan's scarred chest as he sat by the fire. He was focused on the task of whetting a blade, the rhythmic shing-shing of stone against steel the only sound between them, until Carrion stepped into the light. She carried a bowl of medicinal salve she had brewed from the mountain herbs he had taught her to identify. As she knelt beside him, the scent of wildflowers and rain-damp earth followed her, a fragrance that Rowan found more intoxicating than any royal perfume he had known in the capital. He stilled his hand, allowing her to work. Her touch was hesitant at first, then sure, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of the silver-poisoned scars on his side with a tenderness that made his breath hitch. "The village elders were talking again today," she said softly, her eyes focused on the wound. "They say that a woman who cannot shift is like a well without water. They say I am wasting the little value I have on a man who can offer me nothing but a name no one recognizes." Rowan reached out, his large, calloused hand gently catching her chin and forcing her to look up. In the amber glow of the fire, her eyes held a depth of soul that silenced the roar of the alpha within him. He felt the tether between them, the invisible golden cord he had felt since that first night in the snow, tighten until it was a physical ache. "They look for the wolf," Rowan murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "They are blind, Carrion. They look for the beast and miss the divinity. They call you a well without water, but they have never seen the ocean. I have sat on a throne of gold and commanded thousands of shifted wolves, and not one of them possesses the strength I see in you right now." In that moment, the suppressed power of the Alpha King surged, not as a weapon but as a revelation. The ancient primal instinct that governed his kind finally spoke with a voice of thunder. It didn't matter that her wolf was silent. It didn't matter that she couldn't run beneath the moon or hunt in the brush. The soul of the king recognized its equal. She was the anchor to his storm, the the only heart in all the territories that had chosen him when he was nothing but a broken man in the dirt. "You are not a burden, Carrion," he whispered, leaning in until their foreheads rested against each other. "You are my match. In every way that matters to the gods, you are mine." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was his fated mate. Not because of a biological shift or a lunar blood bond, but because she was the only person who had ever looked at him and seen the man beneath the crown. As he pulled her closer, the poverty of their surroundings, the tattered blankets, the leaking roof, the cold wind whistling through the floorboards, felt like the greatest wealth in the world. He was a king who had lost everything, only to find the one thing he had never known he was missing. A love that didn't require power to exist. Chapter 5. The fragile peace of the forest shack was shattered on a Tuesday morning when the rhythmic thud of heavy hooves announced the arrival of the Reyes house guard. Carrion stood in the doorway, her heart cold as she watched her sister, Celine, dismount from a white stallion. Celine looked at the peeling wood and the muddy path with an expression of pure physical revulsion, her silk skirts held high to avoid the filth of Carrion's life. "I had hoped the rumors were exaggerations," Celine said, her voice like ice water. She stepped into the small room, her eyes immediately finding Rowan, who was standing in the shadows near the back wall. Even in his rough tunic, he possessed a stillness that made Celine's guards shift uncomfortably, their hands twitching toward their sword hilts. "But here you are, living in a kennel with a common animal." Celine's gaze dropped to Carrion's hand, zeroing in on the wooden ring. Her face contorted into a mask of disgusted triumph. "You actually married him. You bound the Reyes bloodline to a nameless, shifterless drifter. Do you have any idea what you've done? Our father is negotiating a merger with the Northern Lords, and your marital status is a stain that must be bleached out." "He is my husband, Celine," Carrion said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And this is my home. You have no power here." "I have the power of the law," Celine snapped. She turned her cold eyes toward Rowan. "By the decree of the Silvercrest Council, any vagrant who seduces or corrupts a noble daughter into a non-sanctioned union is guilty of high theft, the theft of lineage. I could have my guards drag him to the pits right now. He would never see the sun again, Carrion. They would break his legs and leave him to rot." Carrion felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at Rowan, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on Celine with a terrifying, predatory intensity that Celine was too arrogant to recognize as danger. Celine stepped closer, pulling a small obsidian vial from her velvet pouch. She pressed it into Carrion's palm, her fingers clamping down like a trap. "Our family needs this problem solved quietly. This is a tasteless, painless paralytic. It will look like a heart failure brought on by his rough life. You will put this in his tea tonight. By morning you will be a widow, and we will bring you home and tell the world you were held captive by a madman." Carrion stared at the black glass in her hand, the weight of it feeling like a mountain. "If you do this," Celine whispered, "we forgive everything. You become a Reyes again. If you refuse, the guards will take him by force and his death will not be painless. I will make sure he screams for days before he dies, and you will be forced to watch." Celine didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and swept out of the shack, leaving the scent of expensive lilies and impending death behind. Carrion stood frozen, the poison burning a hole in her hand. She felt Rowan move behind her, his large hand coming to rest on her shoulder. She expected him to be afraid or perhaps to tell her to run. Instead, when she looked up at him, she saw only an immense, terrifying calm. "She thinks she is the one holding the blade," Rowan said softly, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her. "But she has no idea whose cage she just stepped into." Before we continue the story, please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. Thank you. Now let's continue. Chapter 6. The obsidian vial sat on the rough-hewn table, a dark tooth of glass reflecting the dying light of the afternoon. Carrion looked at it, then at the man she had saved, the man who was now the only world she cared to inhabit. Without a word, she picked up the poison and walked to the window, uncorking it and pouring the black liquid into the soil. It hissed against the earth, dead and useless. "I won't be their instrument," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made the very air in the shack hum. "I would rather be a ghost at your side than a queen in their palace." Rowan moved toward her, his presence a tidal wave of heat and shadow. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wooden ring she had defended against her sister's venom. They want to sever us because they fear what we represent, Carrion. They see a beggar and a broken girl. They don't realize we are the storm they've been trying to outrun. He looked deep into her eyes, his pupils bleeding into a molten silver that no human or common wolf could possess. The handfasting we did was for the laws of men. Tonight I want to bind you by the laws of the stars. I want your soul, Carrion Reyes. Not out of necessity but out of choice. They walked deep into the forest, far beyond the reach of the Reyes scouts and the village gossip. The ancient trees of the northern territories seemed to bow as they passed, the wind whispering secrets in a tongue only the oldest spirits understood. They stopped at a clearing where the moonlight fell in a jagged silver spear through the canopy, illuminating an altar of moss-covered stone. There were no witnesses, no gold-stitched robes, and no hollow prayers. Rowan took a small silver blade, one he had hidden beneath the floorboards of the shack, and made a shallow cut across his palm. He handed the blade to Carrion. Her hand didn't shake. She made the same mark, her red blood mingling with his, which ran with a faint celestial shimmer. As they pressed their palms together, the forest fell into a deafening silence. The temperature in the clearing plummeted, then soared. Rowan began to chant in the old tongue, a guttural resonant sound that felt like it was pulling the very roots of the mountains upward. Carrion felt a sudden violent heat ignite in the center of her chest. It was as if a door that had been locked for 27 years was being kicked off its hinges. She didn't have a wolf's spirit to offer, but she offered her essence, her resilience, her mercy, and her unwavering defiance. The bond snapped into place with the force of a physical blow. A shock wave of pure white light radiated from their joined hands, flattening the grass and sending a pulse through the woods that would be felt by every alpha for 100 miles. In that moment, Carrion wasn't just a woman, she was an anchor. And Rowan wasn't just a king, he was a god reclaimed. The silent wolf of the Reyes family was gone. In her place stood a woman whose soul was now braided into the fabric of the Alpha King's power. They were no longer two people hiding in a shack. They were a sovereign nation of two. Rowan pulled her against him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of iron and eternity. They had chosen love over safety, and in doing so, they had declared war on everyone who dared to stand in their way. Chapter 7. The air inside the small cabin felt heavy with the charge of a gathering storm. Rowan stood by the narrow window, his silhouette cutting a jagged shadow against the floorboards. In his hand he crushed a small scrap of parchment, a message intercepted from a rider bound for the Reyes estate. His eyes, usually a warm deep brown when they rested on Carrion, were now a cold predatory silver that seemed to pierce the very wood of the walls. The charade was reaching its breaking point. They are all there, Rowan said, his voice dropping into a register that made the glass in the window frames vibrate. The High Council traders, the rebel commanders, and your father. They think the winter solstice celebration is the perfect shroud for their final move. They aren't just celebrating the season, Carrion. They are celebrating the transition of my crown to a puppet of their choosing. Carrion watched him, her heart thrumming with the new phantom beat of their shared bond. She could feel his fury, a vast glacial tide, but beneath it was a lethal precision. He wasn't just angry, he was ready. She walked to him, placing her hand over his white-knuckled grip. Through their touch, she saw flashes of his vision. The Reyes ballroom turned into a cage, the hidden daggers beneath silk doublets, and the moment the trap would spring. They believe you are still hiding in the dirt, she whispered, her own voice finding a new strength. They think I am broken and that you are a ghost. Rowan turned to her, his expression softening only for a heartbeat. Let them keep their illusions for one more night. They want a public shaming? I will give them a spectacle they will never forget. Every insult they hurled at you, every drop of wine they spilled on your dress. It's a debt that is about to be called in. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath the hearth, pulling out a heavy, dark bundle wrapped in oilcloth. As he unfurled it, the dim light caught the unmistakable shimmer of royal silver and black obsidian, his ceremonial armor hidden since the day he fell. The sight of it changed the atmosphere of the room, stripping away the pretense of the poor man once and for all. He wasn't a vagrant seeking shelter, he was a king preparing for a slaughter. Go to the estate, Rowan commanded gently, his gaze locking onto hers. Wear the rags they expect. Endure their laughter for 1 hour more. I need them all in that room, confident in their victory before I shut the doors. The Reyes family thinks they are hosting a party to bury us, but they are actually building their own scaffold. Carrion nodded, a fierce, cold pride blooming in her chest. She no longer felt like the sacrificial lamb of the Reyes lineage. She was the vanguard of the Alpha King. As she prepared to walk back into the lion's den of her family home, she didn't feel the weight of their judgment. She felt the weight of the king at her back and the knowledge that by dawn, the world that mocked her would be kneeling at her feet. Before we continue the story, please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. Thank you. Now let's continue. Chapter 8. The winter solstice ball reached the peak of its cruelty as the clock struck midnight. Carrion stood isolated in the center of the Reyes ballroom, her gray wool dress a stark insult to the sea of shimmering gold. Her father, the High Lord Reyes, stepped onto the dais alongside three hooded figures whose presence made the air grow heavy with a foul, oppressive magic, the rebel leaders of the High Council. Tonight we purge the weakness from our blood, Lord Reyes announced, his voice booming with a terrifying finality. Carrion Reyes, for the crime of marrying a vagabond and staining our noble lineage, you are hereby stripped of your name and cast into the outer wastes. Let her beggar husband find her in the snow, if he hasn't already fled like the coward he is. Celine stepped forward, her face a mask of triumphant malice as she raised a ceremonial dagger to symbolically shear a lock of Carrion's hair, the final act of exile. The crowd leaned in, their eyes glinting with the thrill of the kill. Where is he, Carrion? Celine hissed. Where is your king of the dirt? The question was answered by a sound that silenced the world. It wasn't a shout, but a low, resonant thud as the massive oak doors of the ballroom were blasted off their hinges. A shockwave of pure, blinding white energy swept through the hall, extinguishing every candle and shattering the crystal chandeliers. In the sudden, terrifying darkness, a new light began to burn, a molten celestial silver that radiated from a figure standing in the threshold. Rowan didn't walk, he commanded the space. He was clad in obsidian armor that seemed to drink the shadows, and his royal cloak of silver wolf fur billowed behind him like a storm cloud. The suppressive magic of the High Council traders didn't just fail, it disintegrated as his presence expanded. The raw, primal power of the Alpha King hit the room like a physical weight, forcing every noble and soldier to their knees. The sound of hundreds of bodies hitting the marble floor was a symphony of justice. You asked where her husband was, Rowan's voice rang out, a thunderous growl that made the very foundations of the estate tremble. He moved toward the stage, his eyes burning with the lethal fire of a god reclaimed. I have been here watching you spit on the woman who saved the crown you were so eager to steal. Lord Reyes gasped, his face turning a sickly gray as he recognized the man he had called a vagrant. The Silverclaw. Your Majesty. Rowan reached the dais and stepped beside Carrion, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back. The touch sent a surge of power through her that finally shattered the last of her silent wolf chains. You sought to exile a daughter of Reyes, Rowan said, his gaze pinning the cowering High Council traitors to the floor. Instead, you have insulted the High Luna of Aldrian. You have mocked the Queen of the United Territories. He turned to Carrion, and for a fleeting second the terrifying king disappeared, replaced by the man who had loved her in a shack. He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek before he turned back to the room, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper. The time for laughter is over. Now you will learn the price of mocking a king's mate. Chapter 9. He transitioned from the blood-stained ballroom of the Reyes estate to the sprawling white marble of the royal citadel was more than a journey of miles. It was the final shedding of a skin Carrion had outgrown. As the heavy gilded doors of the high throne room swung open, the herald's voice didn't announce the arrival of a disgraced daughter or a silent shifter. It boomed with a reverence that shook the banners hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Her Majesty Carrion Silverclaw, High Luna of the United Territories. Carrion stepped forward, her pace measured and her gaze level. She no longer wore the tattered gray wool of the forest or the borrowed rags of her family's house. Her gown was a masterpiece of midnight silk, embroidered with silver threads that mimicked the ivy patterns of her wooden wedding ring, a ring she still wore proudly alongside the massive sapphire of the Silverclaw lineage. Beside her, Rowan walked not as the rugged vagrant she had nursed back to life, but as a king in his full, terrifying glory. Yet every few steps his hand would seek hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a silent reminder that they were, first and always, mates of the soul. The High Council, or what remained of it after the purges of the traitors, stood in 2 long rows, their heads bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched their chests. Among them were those who had once signed the decrees labeling her bloodline inferior, men who had spent decades measuring worth by the strength of a wolf's howl. As Carrion passed them, she didn't feel the burning need for vengeance that had once simmered in her gut. Instead, she felt a profound, chilling pity. They were trapped in the old world. She was the architect of the new one. She reached the dais, but she did not sit immediately. She turned to look out over the assembled lords, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall without the need for an alpha's roar. For 27 years I was told that silence was a defect, she began, her words steady and sharp. I was told that value was something inherited, not earned. But I was found by a king when he was a beggar, and he was saved by a woman the world called worthless. We did not build our bond on power. We built it on the truth of who we are when the world isn't looking. Rowan took his seat on the obsidian throne, but he reached out and pulled a second throne, equal in height and grandeur, closer to his own. He looked up at her, his silver eyes reflecting a pride so fierce it was almost blinding. The throne was never meant to be sat upon alone, he murmured for her ears only. As Carrion took her place, the final wall within her mind crumbled. The broken wolf was a lie told by people too small to understand her heart. She looked at her reflection in the polished marble floor and didn't see a victim or a survivor. She saw a queen. She had been the only one brave enough to love a monster and the only one strong enough to heal a god. The world had mocked her for marrying a poor man, never realizing that in his poverty, she had found the only riches that mattered. Now, as the kingdom knelt before them, Carrion finally understood. She hadn't been saved by a king. She had been a queen all along. She just needed a king who was worthy of her. Please like, share and comment where you are watching from and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this every day. Thank you and God bless you as you do.